Julie, thanks so much for coming today. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you. You know the format of N of one, right? We care about big data. We care about things that work across numbers of people. But it turns out that everybody's individual story is actually really helpful in understanding how to do that. So we're going to spend some time today talking through your story about how you came to behavioral science in such a magnificent way, and what you're doing at Click and everything that's come before that and all the wonderful things. Julie Miller, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Julie, we always start at the very beginning. So I want to talk about little Julie. I want to talk about like 8-year-old Julie.
Okay.
What did 8-year-old Julie think she was going to be in the world? If I had said, what are you going to be? She would have said, I am going to be a professional rodeo star. I am going to be.
That's a good question. I think there's two versions that happened at the same time in 8-year-old Julie. One version was a doctor, but that was not like a super dedicated, like that wasn't like a dedicated, I'm going to be a doctor. That was more like, I could be a doctor or like a pediatrician. Maybe that's interesting. And the other, which I think was more pervasive in my life, was I was going to be some sort of inventor of something. I don't know that I knew what it was going to be, but I did a lot of inventing of things, largely things that existed, and tried to sell them to like my neighbors and things like that. So
I love this. This is like entrepreneurial young Julie. Do you remember an invention? Like, tell me about what you've invented, Julie.
I mean, they were sometimes just ridiculous things. Like we would tape together, and I also like got my younger brother and sister involved in this scheme. So sometimes it would be like artwork that we would make them buy. Sometimes it would be like this candy dispensing machine. So we would make our own like vending machines out of cardboard and tubes and all sorts of things. And we would make those things. Sometimes we would make, it would just vary. We just made all sorts of like both practical things that existed, but out of like materials we had. And sometimes it would be inventions of things that did magical things that didn't do anything really, but like, or they made like glitter, like they were kind of like Rube Goldberg machines. They would do things and glitter would shoot out, and like that's what it was. And then we would go door to door in our neighborhood and sell them to people.
And this financed your college education. This went well.
No, but it was like the 80s. So people bought things and, it wasn't as dangerous. So people buy things. I mean, we didn't ask a lot of money, but we made it was a good side hustle for children.
100%. My mother loves to tease me about charging my neighbors to watch me run like match car races down our driveway. But adults are suckers, and they will pay for adorable children doing adorable things. I bought pomegranates from a kid down the street today. Do I need pomegranates? No. But, I want to encourage their entrepreneurial spirit, and it costs $2 for a pomegranate. So I'm down.
Exactly. Yeah. And I also don't remember, but I'm pretty sure my brother and sister got either like no cut or like a very minor cut, or maybe I paid them in like candy.
So in other words, Julie Miller / Elon Musk.
Yeah, pretty much, yes. But like I think I paid them in like leftover candy, leftover supplies. I don't even remember. Or like they got older and smarter and we're like, wait a minute, we need like in on this. And then they got a cut.
Then they got a small cut in addition to the candy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's pretty much how it went.
All right. So the entrepreneurial sort of salesy spirit has been with you from early.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely has. And I think part of that, so that was always there, where I was always just thinking about things all the time and thinking about like, what if things were different? What if they were like this? What if they were like that? And part of that, I think, was also that I had like at my elementary school, I lived in Florida at the time, and at my elementary school in, I think, kindergarten, my mom told them in kindergarten, like, she can read. And they were like, oh yeah, like parents are like, my child can read. And they're like, oh, sure they can. That's so cute. But like, I could read full books. And then after like a week, they're like, oh, like, do you know she can read? And like, we don't know what to do with her. And so they then like made me like do other things. So I'd spend like 2 hours in the classroom, and then I would be like the librarian assistant to do random things. And then also had an amazing, like, gifted AIG teacher at that school. So Miss Whiting, so I'll give her a shout out. So I think Miss Whiting did a lot in my early education and supported all the crazy harebrained schemes, all the like just true creativity and belief that you could do anything you wanted to do. And we also participated in a lot of like one of them was like onsets, which is like a logic game, is like competitive with other schools, and like kind of like science Olympiad. We did a lot of those things. So she also like really played a huge role in fostering like the belief that like creativity is valuable, and like inventions and thinking outside the box is valuable. And like all of those things, like, and really I think supported that in a way that I needed it to be supported, which was amazing.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a ton of like very early like proto behavioral science things, right? The notion that the world can be different than it is, right? That counterfactual thinking is something that really serves you well in behavioral science, because you have to imagine a changeable, fungible world where, you can make changes and things can be different, right? It is applied behavioral science for a reason. It's applied, right? Like we want the world to change.
Yeah.
And a little bit of that salesmanship.
There is a less fun side to that, which isn't terrible, like horrible, but also is, I think, a huge core part of like how I am as an adult and why I was interested in behavioral science, which is that since he was drafted, my dad was drafted for Vietnam when he was like 18. And at the time that he was drafted, they realized he had Crohn's disease. And so my entire childhood, he was extremely sick and had really bad Crohn's disease. But because I guess it was the 80s or whatever, my parents didn't know how you told people this. So we as children had we knew he was very sick and he was in the hospital a lot, but they didn't share anything. So largely we were left to so like I was also kind of a mixture of very creative Julie and fun, but also like very adult Julie, because I'm the oldest, very adult, very young, but also spent a lot of time trying to figure stuff out because of that reason. So like we knew he was sick, we didn't know why, we didn't know what caused it, we didn't know all these things. So like my brother and sister dealt in different ways, but I dealt with it by like trying to figure stuff out, like trying to figure out what is happening, what's going on with this, why are people doing this? Like, so I think for me, a lot of that also came probably, which is also led to the like random doctor, I'm gonna be a doctor thought, I'm sure stemmed from that. But also had this like notion of like trying to make sense of things and like figure things out, came from like that piece too, which was like having this kind of sense of like I don't quite know what's happening, and I think if I could figure it out and nail it down, it would be like a lot less anxiety provoking. So I think they kind of dovetail. So one part's really fun, one part's not so much fun, but I think kind of came together.
Yeah, that need for cognition, that need for the world to sort of make sense can be very anxiety reducing, right? Like, it is P equals 0.06. Nice mug.
Yeah.
Uh, it can be very anxiety reducing to sort of feel like the world, if not known, is at least knowable, right? It's not
Yes.
random, it's not chaos. Just because we don't know what's going on doesn't mean that it is not knowable. And one of the sort of advantages of science is the ability to say, well, there is a knowable world, right? And even if it is an unknown known, it's still knowable. And there's a lot of comfort in that for me,
Yes.
right? And I
Yes.
take a
For
lot
me
of comfort in the fact that someone somewhere is probably trying to know it, even if I'm not, right? Somewhere in my sphere of, people who are trying to know things, there's somebody else out there who's trying to know that, and they'll figure it out and bring it back to the rest of us. It's a very tribal sort of like, I don't have to know everybody, but somebody's knowing and coming back with an answer.
Absolutely. Like that is a huge source of comfort for me, which is like I can deal with a lot of different circumstances, even as an adult, and a lot of different things, as long as I kind of have a sense of why they're happening and whatever. Then I'm like, okay, I'm here for you. I'm your person. I'll help with the situation. But it is definitely what you're saying, the need to understand and have that like pieces be linked is an insatiable need, I think, for me, which clearly ties to science.
It's clearly influenced your career.
It's
So
clearly there.
we have
Yeah.
small salesman inventor, 8-year-old Julie.
Yes.
Fast forward a few years. Now you're 15, 14, you're like in, you're starting to get in middle school, high school. Is that coalescing as science? Are you articulating that as a love for science? Or what would sort of, as you started to get more into formalized education and had an opportunity to label this, how was that getting labeled for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think now, like knowing how high school is now, it probably would have come together earlier because now I think there's a different science curriculum and there's more exposure to psychology younger than there was, and there's more of that. For me, what that came together as, not shockingly, since I was kind of like a little baby adult person, young, was I was very much high achieving, shocking, like a shocker. But I also did in high school, it changed as I got older, which is a bummer. But in high school, I had to do very little work because I was able to remember a lot of stuff. So like I had this still had the desire to learn stuff. I was still really into learning a lot of things. Like I really liked math and like calculus and like all of that stuff a lot. Did love like traditional sciences. So I was still like, maybe I'll be a doctor. I don't know. But did still like inventing kinds of things. So still was into like some of that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, I was probably, in hindsight, I was like a nerd, but at the time was not like in the nerd category of kids because I kind of just was in the middle. Like I was a secret nerd because it was like not obvious to the others that I was a nerd. So, but still was totally into all the same things and like learning. Like I loved learning even like in high school. I mean, that's never changed. So like I was like, people would be like, oh, I hate school, I hate learning. Like I was not that person. I was like, I mean, I didn't like work terribly hard, just how I didn't end up in the nerd category of people, I think, at my school, but loved the learning, loved like the figuring out of things. Liked, we had a bunch of classes at that time that like linked together where the same teachers, like between English and social studies and math and science, would like co-teach some things to like connect dots, and you'd have like philosophical discussions. Loved those. Like I was that person who still like wanted to like have debates, and which is also weird because then like you're the high school kids who like wants to think deeply and have debates with other high school kids, and some other high school kids do, and some other high school kids are like, I just want to like leave this class and like get out of here and go to lunch.
Julie,
So
stop
like
being weird, man. Let's just.
they're like, come on, why do you care about this? Like, I was a lot like that. Yeah.
What did you do outside of the classroom? What was teenage Julie into?
So I was in a couple things. My brother was very into computers. Um, at the time, they were like still pretty new. Like, I mean, because I'm like a builder, so like he was very into computers. My dad had been a computer engineer, but he had only had like a high school degree and then training by like Bell Labs. So I was like the first person in my family to go to college. So my dad had become an engineer at like Fujitsu, but had and like a director, but had taken like more of a like self-learning path.
An
And my
applied path,
brother,
which was much more
yeah,
common in those days, right? Like it was possible to start at NASA as a teenager and just sort of be at NASA for the rest of your life.
yeah, exactly. And my brother had the same thing. So my brother took apart all the computers my dad brought home and put them together or whatever. So I would sometimes do some of that with him. We played the old timey like computer games. Like we did that a lot. We played video games a lot. We just like hung out with our friends and normal teenager things, really. Like, I mean, nothing like super exciting. I did do, okay, I take that back. I did one year do like the color guard, and I did do like student council. So I maybe did lean a little more on the.
Also, I like that you're like total normal teenage stuff, taking apart computers, putting them back together again. Like, I'm not sure that was totally what everybody was doing in the 80s, but okay, sure. Like you go nuts. When
Yeah.
what if I had asked teenage Julie like what is your favorite class? Where do you think you're going to college? Like, what do you think is in, did you know early on, like, hey, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to be the first one in my family to do that?
I knew very early on I was going to go to college. I didn't really know, like, I hadn't really thought about where. In hindsight, I think I could have had a lot more choice in where I was going. I kind of just followed some paths. Like it's interesting as we talk through it. And it was like interesting to reflect. I kind of followed some paths. I could have been, if I thought about it, probably gone to a lot more places because of like where I ended up with grades and SAT and stuff. Like had I wanted to, I could have been like, oh, I want to go to like XYZ place. But like it didn't go like that. And in large part, I think it didn't because my dad was super sick when I was in high school. So I was like, I want to go to college. And also like it was a lot of stress. So I was like, I need to leave this environment. Even though I love them and like I love my parents and stuff like that. But I was like, I need to leave. I always knew I'd go to college because that was that was just part of, I just knew that was my path, I think. And then when it came to like applying, I mostly applied to like local places. Um, in large part, I think due to like the proximity to like being near home, and things like that. So
And what did you think you were going to college for? Or was it just like college is the natural
yeah.
thing to do? And so I'm off to college because that's the natural thing to do.
I think it was like that's a natural thing to do. I actually have one child that's in college now and one that's like 16. And I actually almost prefer that because one of my kids goes to NC State and then there you have to declare like what college are you entering, the college of engineering, the college of design. And you're like, when you're 17, like I didn't know. And I felt like it would have been a lot of pressure. And like I went to Carolina, like UNC, and there's more of a liberal arts college. So you just enter as a student and then you figure out what you're going to be and you don't declare your major until later. And I actually think that was super useful for me and probably super useful for like so many kids of that age where I feel like there's a lot of pressure now to like know what you're going to do at 16 or 17. And I don't think I at that time had enough exposure to enough different careers and like as many things in the world that I would have need to be exposed to have made some of those calls at that age. Like I needed to, I knew I would go and I was like, super excited because I was super excited to take all these different kinds of classes and like meet people and like just do all the normal college stuff. But I don't think I was like, this is exactly what I'm going to do. I was just like, I'm ready. Like,
Here I am. Do you,
oh, I'm like, let's go.
so it sounds like you were pretty conscious that you didn't know. It wasn't like, I thought I was going to do this, but I was low conviction. You were like, I have no idea. I'm doing the thing. Yeah, I'm showing up.
Yeah, that's kind of how, yeah, it was pretty much that. I was kind of like, and I think that it was also because I have a lot, I then and still have a lot of interest in a lot of different areas. So even though, like, as a behavioral scientist, like, I have a lot of like, process and like formulas and the ways I approach things, I also still, as a person, end up being a generalist sometimes, which sometimes can be a bad word. People think generalist is a bad word, but like, I don't think it's a bad word. And I have a lot of interest in different areas and domains. And I did at that time too. So it was like hard because there was a lot of things I was into. Like I also did Duke had like a this tips program where you could go in the summer and spend like a couple months there in the summer doing like this like educational thing. You live in dorms and stuff. And so I did that and you take different classes. And it wasn't like I think the premise was you were supposed to come out of that being like, oh, I totally know what I'm going to do. And they wanted you to apply to Duke, right? That was like part of it was like a pipeline thing. So I think they thought that you would come out and you're like, I've got it all figured out. And instead, what happened was I came out and was like, I loved all of those things. I have no idea.
I could do anything.
Yes, that's what happened. It was like, I was like, actually, I was like, I'm bummed because some of the people I met at that program went to high schools that were more had more resources. I mean, I went to a good high school, but I didn't go to like a special high school that had like really cool classes. And I was like, man, I feel like let down. I never have gotten to take like robotics. I never gotten to take like all these like really cool things. So like for me, it was like just getting to see all of it was like I felt even more like I can't wait to get to college and take all these random things because I've never gotten to take all these things before. Like I just want to go.
And so when adults are like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like teenage Julie is like, I don't know, man.
I got no. I'm like I don't know. I'm like so to me, I was like, I don't. So this is the theme, which is like, I don't know, but I want to do something that matters, and something that makes like things better for people. So like there was always the theme in all, I think, other than the candy inventions, all the other inventions and things were always generally centered around how do you make life better? How do you like improve things in like
Julie
ways?
Miller, candy makes life better, okay? Like the existence of
Well,
candy is not such a bad thing in the world.
it is true. So like there was
So
like, yeah, there's like a mission, but like no, yeah, there's
no
no like
definition
plan.
of necessarily of like I am passionate about this and specifically. And so then you go off to UNC, you start taking a smattering of different things, right? You've done these Duke programs that were like, holy shit, I could love everything. Then you go to
Yes.
UNC and you start taking things. Where does it start coalescing into like, hey, because you were a psychology undergrad, right?
Yes.
Where
I
did
was.
that sort of start of coalescing for you?
Yes, this was very clear. So it happened very quickly and clearly. So at first I was like, okay, well, at one point I wanted to be a doctor. So maybe I'll do some pre-med stuff. I took chemistry and in college, it was in the pre-med track, and UNC tries to weed out a lot of people from pre-med. And I got my first ever like non-A. It was not even a B. And I was like, oh no. And I hated it so much. Like I hated it so much. And I was like, I don't think I want to do that anymore because there's like 9,000 more of this class. And at the same time, I took my first ever psychology class, which was like intro. The first day of intro, I remember sitting there and being like, I had never been exposed to psychology before. I never knew it as a field before. And thinking like, oh my God, there's a field that studies all the questions I've always wondered, all the things I've thought about my entire life, like in my own brain. Other people think about these things. Who knew? It's a field. That's it for me. Like that's pretty much exactly what happened. And then it was like just so obvious that that's what I was meant like going to do. So it was like immediately in that first psych class.
You knew. You were like, this is it. These are people are asking the questions I'm asking.
Yeah, I like just didn't know because I was also a person who like thought about things all the time. Like, I mean, even in other classes, I would just be thinking about things like, why are people doing this? What's going on with that? And like I just always in my own brain. And I also understood from talking to my brother, who's not all like that, and other people that other people don't do this. Like I had also gotten to the point by college to realize regular people don't spend their free time thinking about why is this person doing that? And why is that person doing that? And could I change there? Because I was already experimenting on people, like even in my family, like my dad was a smoker. So I'd already tried by this time like 15,000 psych experiments on him to try to change his behavior, right? So I got into this point and I had realized, okay, most people don't think this way. And I, at that point, was like, maybe I'm weird because I think about this nonstop. And then got to this class and was like, oh, like it was mind blowing. I was like, oh my God, there's an entire field of study about this. This is amazing. Like, I'm totally doing this.
So there's really high need for cognition, which I think is one of the defining, you know, behavioral scientists in general. They like thinking. They find it internally and intrinsically rewarding. Like it is part of how they approach the world. They, we're board gamers. We're jigsaw puzzlers. We are people who like doing cognitive activities and are, probably in some very basic way rewarded by that, right? Like I would suspect that there's, someday when we understand the brain better than we do, probably behavioral scientists have some genetic components that are like, hey, we just, we get a little extra squirt of happy juice when we do that thinking thing, when we solve something.
Yeah.
Did you know? So you took intro psych. Did you know it was going to be sort of clinical versus social versus like how did that coalesce for you in that era?
So not necessarily. I took I took intro, and then I took a bunch of other psych classes. Um, and I remember like just take like, you took social, take cognitive, took, psych disorders at the time. It was like psych disorders one, psych disorders two, which I really did enjoy. I remember at the time, I think it was that either then or in grad school, I told my roommate that I think like cognitive diversity were like robots or something. I'm like, who could produce this number of papers? I don't even know. Like, this is insane. But I also worked at a lot of labs. So I was like, okay, I apparently when you're a psych student, you got to work in labs. So I worked in labs, and I worked for like some labs that looked at like social skills development in kids and did like research on that. Then I worked for like Gary Mezebov had a big group there that was called like Project Teach, which was looking at like autism and like a lot of treatment for kids with autism and adults with autism. So I like both did research there, but then also worked there part time and worked there for a long time. And then I worked with Konstantin Sedehides on like work there, and like I worked in like social labs. I worked in like a bunch of different labs. So I did. I mean, again, I did a bunch of different kinds of research and worked in like a bunch of different psych labs because you number one or like at UNC you're required to do a certain amount of like independent research projects with different professors. And two, and then you could have done them all in one field, but I wasn't sure. So I just did different, completely different ones. Like I remember doing some of the Confederate studies, like the old timey ones where there was less regulations. Like where you have to like anger people and watch their behavior. Like we totally did all those things.
Back when you could still do that kind of stuff. Some of it is horrifying, but we learned a lot from it.
Yeah, we did. So I did all that, all these different kinds of research projects.
So you're all of these labs, you're doing all this stuff, and then you had a somewhat rarity. You kind of went right off to grad school after undergrad, right? You were like one of those bridgers. When did it become clear to you that like, hey, graduate education is the thing that's going to follow here?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what kind of happened was around my junior year, maybe. I think I had your annual, you got to meet with your advisor meeting. And they're like, so FYI, you're a psych major. You're probably not getting a job after this without a graduate degree. So you probably want to go to some kind of grad school. You probably want to think about that. And I was like, oh, like, all right, I probably should think about that. So then like, well, what kind of grad school do you want to go to? And by this time, I had worked in enough psych labs to realize like I was not super into, even at that time, like a very academic track of like, I'm going to publish, I'm going to get grants, I'm going to do whatever. Cause I saw what that looked like and I was like, I'm going to pass on that. So I was like, I don't think I'm going to do that. And I did really love clinical a lot. Like there was a lot of things about clinical I liked because it was more action, like it has a bias towards action, right? Which is like even the like through research, but also like intervention wise, I was like, I mean, I was doing this my whole life. I'm like trying to fix people and change things about them through weird experiments. So I was like, this is a natural fit. So I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna go to clinical, I guess. So basically just was like figured out like what do you got to do to go to grad school and clinical. And more or less like kind of figure like just realize that's what I was gonna do. And narrowed down to like a few schools and applied and luckily got accepted to one because they're super competitive to get accepted to. Um, and I mean, it's gotten even worse, I think, but they're extremely hard to get into now. I think even more then, which is really brutal for people now. But yeah, so I decided to go to grad school for clinical.
And did you have a sense that like, and then I'll leave academia and become a clinician and like work in a hospital? Like, what did you think was coming after grad school?
Yeah. So a lot of these questions, I think, assume I was thinking way further ahead than I was, which is valid. But I'm not sure I thought about that much at
You're
that
just like,
time.
the next thing is grad school.
Yes. And I also must point out, because I think this is relevant, that while I was at UNC, we went to the Final Four all 4 years. So there was also a lot of drinking and things that happened this period of time. So there was also stuff happening in life. And so I was both thinking about my future and thinking about my current
You were
present life
thinking about your
at the time.
future drink, as in the next one.
I was also doing a lot of that, yes. So I was balancing work-life balance.
Well, but at the same time, you were being very successful in school. You were working across labs. You were doing a great job. And as you pointed out, you were getting into grad school at a time when it was competitive. So as much as we might tell jokes about the fact that you were enjoying your partying, clearly that was not necessarily at the expense of what else was going on. And, as a fellow first gen college kid, you're just paddling to try and keep your head above water, right? It's not like there's I remember having a conversation with a kid at school, and I sort of realized that, like, his parents were professors and his grandparents were professors and his great grandparents were, they just like had that, so he, like, of course he knew what was coming next because
Yeah,
everybody in his family had been doing that. And if you're a first generation kid, you're like, wait, they pay you to go to grad school? You get a stipend? Like, what is this nonsense? Like, what I teach? I just graduated. How am I going to teach undergrads? Well, congratulations. You're now one year
I had
older
no
than them.
I had no clue about any of it. And like my dad had worked up a way we talked to my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So like I just didn't know that much about some of those things and like what was gonna happen and like what grad school looked like and what the path after looked like. So I was just like, I was just kind of like, I'm gonna go. I think I probably assumed I would do therapy because that's what 99% of clinical people did, especially then. Like that's just what the path um was doing becoming a therapist. I'm sure I assumed that's what I was going to do when I like chose to go there. I think that's probably what I was thinking at the time.
And so then you get into grad school. You're off at UNC. You're like doing the grad work. You love it. You hate it. Like, it feels natural. It feels unnatural. Like, tell me a little bit about grad school.
Yeah. So I loved it, but I was also a person who switched advisors in the middle of grad school. So I got my master's with one person and my PhD with somebody else. And that
Because
was like,
they move schools, your interest changed.
no,
Like,
because
what?
my interest changed, but it was a big drama at the time. Now, even like a couple of years later, it was totally fine. But at the time it was like dramatic. But
But you felt strongly enough about it that you were like, I know I have a different interest.
yes. So my master's thesis is in schizophrenia and psychosis proneness.
Okay, so like
Which
very clinical.
yes, yes. And I do like that field. And I think it's fascinating. Like it was interesting. I liked it. I loved grad school because I love learning. It was all sorts of stuff. It's all up my alley. It's like all the things I love to think about, but like that's my homework. That's my school. I'm like, yay. Also you start seeing patients like pretty early in grad school in
Right.
clinical. And so I love seeing patients. And so that was great. So I was happy. I just knew within a decent amount of time, like my advisor at the time, I think saw me as having a more academic trajectory in the psychosis proneness world. And I didn't want to do that. And then it wasn't really my passion. I know this is going to be a huge shocker to you based on my family background, but I was far more interested in health and in more like health psychology. So I was like, I really care much more about the intersection of physical health and mental health and want to move to doing that much more than doing like really deep, severe mental illness.
Got it.
So
And
I
so you
caused
brave
drama,
the drama, right?
did.
You get through the drama, you're off. Now you're working more on health psych stuff. You were in
Yeah.
grad school for a while. right? Like, there are
I
some
was in
kids
grad
who
school.
are like, how fast can I do this? And you were, because you switched, you spent some real time there and you had some great publications come out of that work.
I was in grad school for like 100 years, I think. Um, in part because I switched, and in part because there's a couple of things. Because I mean, this is how it worked, but my university, which was UNC Greensboro, did not have a medical school. So trying to find access to resources to get experience with specifically like medical people, medical populations and things like that was not the most obvious. And also, I really like, I had a specific idea in mind for doing my dissertation, which was like looking at like attachment and coping and things like that in teenagers that have a parent with cancer. And I was very interested in oncology. And because of the fact that we did not have a medical school or a hospital and some other factors, I applied for NIH funding and got NIH funding for my dissertation. And so because of that, I probably would have like ended my dissertation earlier, but because I had funding, I had to like reach certain end and like did a certain sizes. So it also drug out longer because I was like, I have to like meet the NIH standards for having an R03. And I like, because you have an R3, they expect that you're gonna do the things. So I had like people that advised me from like Wake Forest University and like UNC and other hospitals. And so I didn't want to let them down, but also I needed to like fulfill my obligations to the NIH. So so it took longer because I needed to like recruit more people.
So you learned quickly the rigors of traditional academia and grants, right? Uh, so you do this R3, which is awesome. You get all this stuff out. You're sort of torn between. It sounds like a lot of pressure to go the academic route, right? Once you start getting R3 grants, they're like, go get more, bring us more money, please. Uh, and your desire to maybe do something more applied.
Yeah.
How does this sort of manifest as you get toward the end of your graduate degree? Like, where is your head at in terms of like, okay, this is coming to an end.
Yeah.
You've got these two warring factions, right? One of which is more something you're interested in, one of which is more being imposed on you. How does that net out for you?
So my advisor at the time was very supportive. She is like been a professor for a long time. I think she's retired now. But she like, and it was also a huge reason why I think I became a behavioral scientist in the long run, which is like Rosemary Nelson Gray. And she was like studied literally like with Hans Eysenck, right? Like she was like a behaviorist, right? And like would talk about these people like old school behaviorists that she like knows personally and things. So like she was a behavioral person, but she also didn't have as much pressure for me to do academic work. And to be honest, I got the RO3. They weren't even like, you should do it. I was like, I need money to be able to run the study I want to run. They were like, fine, but you got to write the whole thing yourself. And I was like, all right. So like they didn't care so much. I mean, they were like glad, but she was like, whatever, you do you. So like, I think she's proud of me, but there was no like pressure that I was going to have to do more stuff. She was just like, okay, like I'll support you in what you need, but like, she didn't care.
And so then you graduate and you go off to start looking at like postdoc stuff.
Yeah.
Did you think you were on the academic track? Did you think you were on the therapy track? Or you like, I'm going to have a private practice and be a professor? Like, where did you think you were going?
So for clinical PhDs, we have to do a year of internship full time.
Yep.
And you get matched the way you do with residency. So like you have to apply like the way you do with residency, like a whole bunch of people don't match. Like you apply, like there's only a few places per state, really. So you have to apply all over the country. By this time, I also had a child. So like that's partly why I was in grad school so long. I had like a 2-year-old. And so it's a lot. And so you're not officially graduated till you've done your full year of internship. So like you have to do that first. So I only applied to places that were very heavily medical. So like all of my places were like basically filling in some gaps on the medical experience that I really wanted, and really needed to have. And like, that's how that was like how I prioritized my list or whatever. Um, and so I ended up going to the Heinz VA, which is outside Chicago, which was amazing. I mean, the VA system can, get a lot of flack, but it also can be amazing. And that VA system was amazing. Also, you do an insane amount of hours, depends on the place, but we did an insane amount of hours of clinical practice in graduate school. And our graduate program was set up so it wasn't just students, it was like a Medicare, Medicaid based clinic. So we saw everybody, but I would say like 90% of the people are women, right? Because that's who self refers. So going to the VA is great because like you see mostly dudes. So like that was great. So like the Heinz VA allowed you to really have all the choice in picking your rotations. So I got to pick what rotations I did. So I did like primary care, I did spinal cord injury, I did blind rehabilitation. And then if you wanted to, you could choose to do one of them at Loyola because Loyola is their partnered university and it's next door. So I did psycho-oncology at Loyola because I was obviously very into
Obsessed with
oncology.
oncology.
I was in oncology. So, but you got a lot of choice. So I went and did those, loved it. I was like, I mean, I love seeing patients and especially in medical settings. So saw like a lot of patients that are in the hospital for medical reasons and a lot of patients outpatient, like for primary care reasons and things like that. So I was doing
And
that a
then
lot.
you graduate, right? You've done your internship,
Graduate.
you graduate, and then talk to me about sort of how you see what comes next for you.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're still not seeing yourself as what we would think of as an applied behavioral scientist, right? You're often clinical, you're doing this
Yeah.
piece like
I have a weird path. So what I did then was I did a postdoc at Chicago Center for Family Health, which is like a family systems approach to like dealing with health related issues. And that one was also based in like a medical center. So I did that. And then at that point, I'd had a second child. So what I did for a long time was did a lot of teaching. So at one point, I think I taught adjunct at like every university in the Chicagoland area. And that's largely what I was doing because there's no way I could afford to have two kids in daycare. So I was married and my husband worked, and then I taught adjunct mostly in the evenings, but sometimes in the day, and like did that for a long time. So that kind of was just how it was going for a while, was just like doing that for a bit of time. And mostly just teaching like all sorts of psych classes, health psych, graduate level classes and things like that. And I do love teaching. So it was nice. I mean, I like teaching a lot. And then about maybe 10 years ago, I don't know if it's quite 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, my father passed away. We had already been thinking we might move back to North Carolina anyway, but he passed away after he'd been sick for, a long time. And so we were like, we moved back to North Carolina. And we were back here. And then I was like, well, I had worked at Duke before. And so I reached back out to some people at Duke, like Frank Keefe and like pain prevention and treatment. And I was like, I'll see if they need people. So I contacted him and went back to working kind of in like research, like, but it's kind of like clinical research, like could we digitally, and I'll explain this in a minute, like digitally deliver pain interventions to these cancer patients and arthritis patients and things like that, which I liked, but two things. One, it was just like to me, and like no offense to the people doing this because they were great people, but it was just like the same things over and over again. It was also only available to like Duke patients. And the digital elements, for the most part, at that time were like, we're going to hand you a Duke iPad. It's going to have a Skype link to your therapist and like 4 relaxation videos and like whatever. And like, I was like, this is not really like what I imagined this is going to be like. So
This is 2015, this is 2015, and you're thinking, hey, look, there's probably more
I was like,
sophisticated versions of
seems
this.
like it's not really like I see what things are happening out in the world, see what we're doing. Like there's a gap here. And like I know how academia works. And we were making things that were efficacious, but there was like such a divide. So I was like, so I didn't like it, so we need to change. And then this is a bit of serendipity that happens. I don't know if we've talked about this. I think we have. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. It hadn't even been that long. It's been like 6 months. It's been like 6 months. I was like, I don't do this anymore. And the Pokemon Go had just come out like the week before, something like that. My kids wanted to play Pokemon Go in this one area that had special Pokemon. We were playing Pokemon Go. I saw the sign that said Duke Center for Advanced Hindsight. I was like, what's that place? I looked it up and I was like, oh, that's Dan Ariely's lab. I didn't even know who Dan was then. I was like, who's Dan Ariely? And I was like, I had no idea. But then when I read one of his books, I read some stuff about what he was doing. I was like, that's much more what I want to do because I'm feeling so trapped in what I'm doing. And even when I was seeing patients where I'm like, I feel like this needs to be done way more at scale. It feels like there's so many factors that I'm missing as a therapist that like you're dealing with like in a one-to-one level. It was a little bit better in my postdoc because you're looking at a family system. So it's like much more systems theory based. So like, but you're still not all the way to like where I needed to be. So I was like, this is what I gotta do. And so I saw Dan was trying to do some health work, but they at the time didn't have anyone who had done work on the med center side. Like they had people who'd done like wellness stuff and like no offense to the people. I mean, I love them all, but they'd done more wellness. They'd done a lot more like none of them were clinical psychologists. They were like cognitive and things, which is all fine. But like you kind of need to transition over to the med center side because it can be not, there can be attitudes between the doctory med center side and the academic side. So I emailed Dan. I was like, hey, I want to work for you. And Dan travels, like a lot. And he's like, I happen to be in town doing this talk for like all the bank leaders of the world or something tomorrow. Come to the talk and then and eat the dinner. And then I'll meet you at like 10 p.m. And I was like, all right, that sounds weird, but sure. So I did that. And then we talked. And then he's like, can you start in like 2 weeks? And I was like, all right. And so then I went to work at the lab.
This sounds very Dan.
It is very Dan.
Sounds very Dan. And so, and how was that transition, right? You're coming from this very clinical environment into, as you point out, a not very clinical environment, a little bit of chaos, definitely a different vibe than medical center. How did that work out for you?
Well, I'll just give the honest version. And also I'm gonna give you the honest version. And I will say all of the people that I worked with at the lab, I do like, and most of them I keep in touch with, and I do like them all. But I will say that it was not an easy transition. And there was, in my feeling, a lot of conceptions about what clinical psychologists do and what they can do, and about how they do research, which was not how I did research, like especially working in like med center RCTs on like efficacy of interventions. And like to me, there were some things that were very similar and some things that were super different, right? Like about the approaches and about the way you approach the work. And so to be honest, like there was a lot of times where it was not super easy. There was a lot of people that were great. There was a lot of times where I also felt very much like an odd duckling there who did not fit in with what they were used to. Or I don't know, like it just felt like kind of weird. Like sometimes I'll be like, practically, I bring up practical things, like practically the doctors aren't going to let you do that. And like, nobody wants to hear that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean? Now, so like there was things that made it challenging. And there was a huge learning curve because, and like, this, but like, even though clinical and behavioral science seem so similar in some ways, and some of the principles are similar, they're also directly in opposition in some ways. Like there are some parts that really are extremely different, or you take extremely opposing viewpoints, where even in current work, sometimes people are like, I wish that you had hats where sometimes you can have on your clinical hat and sometimes you can have on your behavioral science hat. So we know which one we're talking to because they're very different. And I'm like, I totally understand that. So to me,
Push in on that difference for a second, right? Is it the clinical cares about, individual behavior change and applied cares about group behavior change? Like, what's the sort of tension there?
yeah, it's some of that, some of it's that. And like getting to the point where it's more about populate, like what's best for the population level versus the individual. But some of it's more like, some of it is things like, no, I mean, it's not surprising that like as a clinical person, usually you're taught that that there's some amount of internal change needs to precede external change. And as a behavioral scientist, especially in Dan's lab, because there's a kind of like more certain approach that he uses on certain things, there's definitely a feeling of like, no, you don't need internal change. External change can lead to external change, right? And the internal change and education and all those things oftentimes are completely irrelevant, or actually like not, like they're not useful, and they sometimes are like detrimental and like certain, not like detrimental, but like get in the way. And so there's like certain things where like they are in like opposing, right? Or like the fact that like in behavioral science, you really are looking to change overt behaviors. But for example, you can sometimes in my work, I'll also be using behavioral science to improve like depression. And so then you're like, well, what is that? And how do you do that? Right. Like, because that's weird because it's not directly observable. So like there are things that are very different about the fields. Um, and just the role of context versus the role of like internal drive and internal.
Emotion, cognition, sort of, cultural things, background, history, all of the things that we bring to things, which, I don't think behavioral scientists don't believe in those. Like, no rational person says, well, you don't have internal emotions or cognitions, you're just your behaviors, IO, right? No one says that. But because of the nature of doing group work, you have to gloss over those individual differences. Like your individual emotions and cognitions, I have to extract away at some point in order to be able to do collective work, in order to do things that affect larger populations. So there's this weird tension where it's like, I believe in those things, but I have to sort of pretend that they don't matter
Yeah.
in this, in order to get the thing done that I'm going to do. So you're in Dad's lab, you're feeling like a little bit of a fish out of water, and then you end up in this really interesting sort of Wake County innovation role. How did that come about? Like, did you have your head on the swivel? Like, if we plot the points, that is a weird job for a clinical psychologist to take, right? That feels like a very hard right turn.
It is.
Dan's lab is an interesting off ramp that makes that turn less weird, but it is still a very, tell me a little bit about how you start. And in many ways, this is your first traditional applied behavioral science job, right? You are like leading applied innovation work within a system.
Yeah.
What
So a
happened?
couple things happen there. One, well, I will also say I got more used to lab. I figured out some stuff too, and I figured out how different certain things were and how like what they were saying. In hindsight, I also realized some of the things that people were telling me were right. I also learned that some of the things that I was saying were right, and we actually needed both of those things. But I will say that, like, and we can talk about that later, but like one of the things I think that, and this is how I got to the innovation one, I think in part, was one, I think the thing that, regardless of people's feelings about Dan and things that happen, one of the things I will say about Dan is I will forever be grateful to him, because one of the things about the way his brain works is that it is so open and so creative and so like anything is possible in a way that like 8-year-old Julie had, but adult Julie lost at some point. So what happened was I became because of the systems I had been working in, too practical. So it was so, I will always be grateful for him for like opening my eyes and helping me see like some of these are self-imposed limitations, or some of these are things that I should not be worried about at this moment. So even now, if I get stuck on problems, it's so dorky. But if I get stuck on problems, I'll be like, I need to have a like Dan moment. So I'll like stop. And I've talked to Dan about how does he do it. So like I've got some insight. So I'll be like, stop, and I'll be like, okay, like what if everything I believe about what drives this behavior is incorrect? What am I going to do then? And like I'll intentionally have to take these moments, because if not, I will be the too practical version. So like it completely pivoted all of that for me, not only to give me the behavioral science skill set and like an entirely different way to approach problems, but it really changed fundamentally how I like think about things and what's possible and doable. And that's kind of what transitioned over for me into the other role, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Was your head on the swivel? Like, how did the actual opportunity, as you think about like sort of career development, how did you sort of
It's
end
kind
up?
of weird. It's kind of weird. So at Dan's lab, I also worked really, really heavily. We had a startup incubator. Most of the work I did there was digital. So I like was doing a lot of like lead for this giant digital project we did with Novartis on like getting like designing this intervention to get people to take their meds that had heart failure. I was doing a ton of work on digital, and we had a startup incubator, and I worked at the startup incubator all the time. So like some of it was like, okay, I had also gotten hooked up with some of the innovation people in innovation in our like local region and doing stuff. And so I saw this posting. I don't even remember why. I think there was like a couple of years had gone by. I was feeling like some of the work I was doing at Dan's lab I loved, but also I was feeling like it was still kind of staying in academia a lot, where we'd publish and then other academic people would read it and be like, oh, that's fascinating. But then like it would never was making it into actual apps and like stuff. Like it never got anywhere. And like I was helping a lot of doctors. I was working with a lot of doctors at Duke at one point as their like behavioral science friend to like help them with stuff. Like doing this like kind of internal consulting thing. And but then those apps never became anything outside of Duke. So I was like, I feel like I need to leave this academic thing. So there's this innovation job, and I know that we've been doing a lot of work on like nudge units too, with some nudge units in Durham, and I was like, that sounds interesting the way it's described. I think I could bring behavioral science there and do some stuff to teach them how to use behavioral science and improve some stuff and blah 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 and some other things. So I applied, I got it. I told Dan. Dan was like, no problem, but you know government's bureaucratic, right? And I was like, well, healthcare is bureaucratic. How much worse could it be? Oh, I learned it's about 10 million worse. It's way worse. However, it was also amazing because what happened there was I was doing behavioral science, but that was only a part of my job. That was like a sliver of my job. The majority of my job was actually very different. And when I started, if I'm totally honest, I did not have the skill set for that. So I realized that within like week one. What they actually needed was people that were heavily trained in design and design thinking and service redesign and UX design to run these groups from the different places like the Animal Center, Health and Human Services, the Sheriff's Department, through the process to rework the services they offered people, their apps that they offer, like all of these different things for different reasons. They all had different problems they were trying to solve. And so behavioral science helps there, but it wasn't the entire solution. So I took a whole bunch of trainings and from different places like IDEO and other places in like all these kinds of like, how do you run design thinking? How do you do all this stuff? And harassed and found like the most helpful people in the area who run like innovation at Cisco, who run innovation at this, and like learned like, okay, how do you set up a training program for people to come and learn how to do this? And like, how have you done it? And how do I do this? And so I just like spent a couple months just figuring out how I'm going to do this. And so I did that, and then started running people through this thing, and running people through like this whole process of like design thinking and service redesign with behavioral science like baked in. And then also did a bunch of like classes, lunch and learns, and like how to use behavioral science in like emails you're sending to do XYZ, like very targeted things. And then built up this like innovation curriculum and like whole system where people like different people from the county get like nominated and go and train and like bring it back to their own groups so they can be their leaders in their own like departments. So there's like an infrastructure. So it was actually great. It was just slow. It was just very slow.
How did you, you give long answers, so I'm going to bring you back for a second. How did you get the job, right? You applied, like, how did you convince, one of the things that we always hear from people is, I know what I want to do, but I can't convince anybody to let me, right? You're coming from this interesting sort of clinical background. How did you convince them that you were the candidate?
Yeah. So I think had I just straight applied, I would have never gotten the job. So this is how I usually get jobs, I guess. I applied, but I also figured out who were the people hiring and emailed them and said, like, this is what you're asking for. But I also been working like with Dan Ariely doing XYZ. I think you also need this. And this is why you need this. And this is why it would be helpful. And they were like, yes. And then that's how it went.
So are you channeling a little 8-year-old Julie being like, let me tell you why you need a Rube Goldberg machine that sprays glitter everywhere, right? Like, let me tell you why you need this in your life.
That is exactly it. Yes.
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily that there was behavioral science in the job, but you saw an opportunity to put behavioral science in the job and then said, here's why you're missing. Here's that 5th bullet point that you don't have. Let's talk about like the hidden bullet point.
Yes. It listed no behavioral science. It was just like, it was completely open and innovation. But it had startups, and I work with a lot of startups.
Got it. So there was enough stuff to bridge where you could credibly say, hey, I've done some of this. And then there was some, hey, there's a hidden bullet point that you don't, that I need to convince you of.
Yeah.
And that sold you in. And so then you're in government. It's slow as hell. You're doing much less project work, much more teaching, which you love. You have lots of teaching experience, right? So it was more about, teach a department to fish. You're doing some lighthouse projects, but it's teaching a department to fish. And you did this for almost 2.5 years. I mean, which is about 200 million years in government years. How did you sort of get through that time, right? Like, I know it was frustrating. We were friends, and so I got to hear about it. As you trained over 300 employees, did 10 plus projects a year.
Yeah.
How did you sort of balance that?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways. One, it was frustrating, but it was also amazing because, for example, we ran mini experiments like at the animal center because the director of the animal center was very open to behavioral science. So we'd be like, I think if we put these kinds of visual markers over here, it'll lead more people to these cats that you want them to see. And there were certain dogs that are known as like the problem dogs. And what they don't want
is you can just say pit bull, okay? We all know who it is. We all know the reputation.
So like the problem dogs, they don't want them actually to be just adopted by anyone because then they get returned. So like we would like run mini experiments all the time. Like I would go there, we would tape shit up. We would just do like on the ground experiments on things. And they were very open to that. And like a lot of the people I worked with, like even in like in the emergency operations center, like they were all very open. So we ran lots of mini experiments. And I think what got me through it was the system is bureaucratic, but the people that I worked with were open-minded and wanting to learn and interested and wanting to improve things. And so like that's partly how you get through it. Is they're like dedicated and they care about their work and they care about the citizens and like that stuff. And I'm very mission driven in my work usually. So like that means a lot to me. So I feel like it improved a lot of things for a lot of people. So like that got me through a lot. And some of it's fun. I mean, you can see cats and dogs on a daily basis and things like that. And then part of it also was that I think at that time was when I started consulting. So I've always consulted since then, but I was consulting at one point at like 3 companies at a time. So I was consulting at like a smart underwear company and like an AI company and a wealth management company. And like I was just consulting, doing straight behavioral science consulting pretty much. So I was getting some of the needs that I had that were not being fulfilled in one place, fulfilled in other places.
Got it. So you were cheating on your government job with your
Yeah, so
one night stand health startups here. I see how it is.
I was.
And then you made the decision to leap. I mean, you went off to Bayer for a while, and then you were at Mahana, and you sort of have started to do more very clear applied behavioral science based, sort of health work. Was that sort of a conscious cognitive, like, I have this health background that I love and miss. I'm doing this behavioral science stuff and I want to get those closer together. Like, how did the sort of let's do Bayer, let's do Mahana kind of come about?
That's a good question. So some of it is a yes. So I did, especially the bear job. The listing was like, I can't resist this thing. It's like we're gonna make things. I don't think it's a secret anymore. We're gonna make things for like menopause and like cancer and like things that I'm like, oh, those are my things. And like we're gonna use. They were looking for a behavioral scientist specifically to work on this team making something from scratch. And like I work there all like most of my consulting, not all of it. Some of it's CX, but a lot of it's in product. And it was like making products and like doing this and all the things I love to do. So that one was like a no-brainer because I was like, that's like all stuff I love to do and things I care a lot about. So I did miss health. So I went back to it. And then yeah, the others, I mean, when I went to Mahana was I think very similar, which was like I liked what they were doing. I liked that like the kinds of products they were making, the team, how they were approaching it, the fact that like I would be leading a team to like make a bunch of new products was really exciting. And they were very open to like this merging because I have like a very weird background. I mean, this like merging of like clinical psych with behavioral science, with design, with like all these weird Frankensteiny things together. And they were like, we fit like there's a Julie sized hole and like, yay. And like, so that kind of fits. But so yes, I think that's largely how I got back into health. But then I oftentimes, as you have mentioned, tend to cheat on those things with side hustles because I do love other things. And so that I get those like other behaviors like AI or gaming or whatever fulfilled through like side consulting projects.
Well, and that's a really important part of career growth, right? Is recognizing you're not going to get everything in the same place. I mean, it's a little bit sort of like romantic relationships. Like there's a reason we have friends. My spouse is not necessarily going to love absolutely everything I love. I'm going to have my gaming friends and my boxing friends and my people who, rather than trying to force my partner to like absolutely everything that I like, there's a benefit to saying, hey, there's this core place where I'm doing the core of my work, but I have these other, ways to scratch itches.
Yeah, I agree. I think like one of the things that's progressed for me over the past like year to 2 years is I think like one thing I think that's become a little bit more clear to me. And like it started because of I was doing some work with some like and having some discussions with some amazing people around like the mental health and health industry at large. And there are some things like I want to see the industry and myself shift more towards. And so like those are things I've been trying to work towards. Now, granted, some of this happens in my daily work, some of it happens on the side, but like right now we have kind of a fragmented, like there's an app for everything approach, which is helpful. And there's a lot of benefit to that. And like for digital therapeutics, there's some benefit, especially things are paid by insurance because then it allows for a lot more equity and access to things people couldn't have. And like I really believe in that. But also one of the things that I'm really profoundly interested in and missed an opportunity for a role that I really did also found interesting was like, how do we take a lot of the principles of wellness and well-being and behavior change and infuse those back into what people use every day and like have a much broader impact on like, rather than having them come to you, go to where people are and do that. So like, I've been trying to work towards like like that, like thinking more about like how do I move in that direction? And a lot of companies are as well. So it kind of matches up well. Which is like, how do you take those principles and instead of making one more anxiety app, you know what I mean? Like bring it forth because we're having this as like an epidemic, right? And we all use some of the same products and we all have some of the same experiences. And so I'm thinking a lot more about like how to approach some of that, and how do I do that and what do I want to do in that realm. And then one of the other areas that I've been thinking about a lot, and it infuses a lot of my work, it started actually in Dan's lab, was doing a lot of work on meaning in life and like life purpose. And so like there's a lot of the stuff that I'm doing that kind of cuts across that, like regardless of the field. Like even like wealth management, a lot of it was focused on meaning in life. And that's the same is true in a lot of like mental health apps. And it kind of applies to so many things. So there are like some things that feel on the outside very different, but like truly are not at their core. Um, I don't know. I mean, we've talked and you know me. Like it's like I don't know if other people feel this way. They probably do. Like some in some ways at my age and my career, I feel like you kind of get the message like, oh, you should be a specialist in one area. And like clearly for me, on paper, especially, it looks very health. Like you were like, you are health. That is you. And like, yes, I have a lot of expertise in health and I have that. But and so sometimes but like that's not my only thing that I like to do. So then I think for me, I don't know if other people are the same. Like it raises questions like I'm like, am I supposed to be like 100% like that's my only thing I like or not? And like I have a lot of other interests and a lot of other behaviors and things that I find very interesting and want to work on and have the skill set to work on and feel compelled to do all these things. But you know, it's tricky. It's tricky to balance.
For sure. And much is made of the American monogamy context of romance, right? We are very, as countries go, we're a very monogamy focused country. But I think that often carries over into other things, right? We have this sort of like monogamy focus about everything. You're supposed to love one thing, one hobby, you know, one person, one job, one area, one specialty. And that's, sort of the American context, rather than, what might be a much slightly more fanciful path that sort of, you know, at different times scratches different needs. I was talking to somebody the other day about AI, and I'm much more compelled by everything getting 1% smarter than one thing getting 100% smarter, right? It's much more interesting to me, to your point. Like, I don't want to build another specialty app that a niche of people have to go and do the thing. Like, I just want to make stairs 1% better than stairs used to be, right? I want to make food 1% better than food used to be. Because when you do that at scale, I mean, it can be incredibly impactful. Microsoft is a great example of this, right? It's not quantum leaps forward. It's, a suite of tools across pretty much everything that you do, that if you can just slightly enrich and slightly enrich and slightly enrich and slightly enrich, you get this lovely incremental sort of progress as a culture and a society. So I can totally hear that. I mean, look, you've had a wonderful and fascinating career. You've done all of these wonderful things. Like, and it's lovely to see you continuing that as you, both at Click and beyond, as you sort of date other things and continue to spread your impact. And in some ways, it's easy to predict your future because we can look at your past. I
Yeah.
bet there'll be some teaching. You haven't been
There's a lot
teaching as
of
much recently. I'm
yeah.
imagining that'll probably happen again, right? Because that's a reoccurring theme. We know there are two or three things that you're going to keep coming back to, coming back to, coming back to. So I'm on the lookout for the Julie Miller training course, the Julie Miller book, the Julie Miller passing on the knowledge that she's accumulated. But alas, our knowledge sharing now must come to an end, right? We've been at this for a while. I appreciate you, Julie, as always. It's lovely to talk to you. Thanks for spending some time with me and sharing your experiences. I do think, you have such a unique journey. There are elements that resonate, right? If you listen to enough of the N of One podcasts, clearly there's an entrepreneurial need for cognition, interest in change sort of theme. Lots of first generation college kids, end up in applied behavioral science. I don't think that's an accident, right? Like there are the corollary and, or antecedents that I think probably make sense, but each story is unique, and you're such a unique person. And I appreciate you coming and spending some time with me.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
It's always fun.
Walk down memory lane.
Well, and more to come, the future.
I know, who knows? There's so many weird, fun things to do. It's like, how can you limit yourself, right? Something new every day.